Hi, America. Hello, world, and welcome to episode 2 of the Looming Fiscal Crisis series being brought to you by the Compact for America Educational Foundation and the commissioners of the Compact for a Balanced Budget. In this episode, we will highlight how the federal budgeting process is intended to work, why it is consistently not worked, and one potential solution to restoring sound budgeting principles within Congress. My name is Chip DeMoss, and I will be the host and director of this episode. I am the executive director of the Compact for America Educational Foundation, which has been designated as the official administrator of the Compact for a Balanced Budget. The Compact currently has 5 member states, and the legislatures of each of the member states has designated the Compact Commission as the official governmental body to represent the member states before Congress when it comes to federal budgetary matters. With me today, we have 3 members of the Foundation's Council of Scholars. First, we have Dr. Robert Gemeiner, who is a professor of economics at Methodist University in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Next, we have Dr. Sven Larson, who is an international economist working from Wyoming, who is currently focusing on how to protect and stabilize the federal welfare system in times of crisis. And we're happy to have with us today Mr. Baker Spring, who is our Capitol Hill policy expert in Washington, D.C. Baker has spent time on the staff of the Senate Budget Committee and brings actual working knowledge and experience of the congressional budgeting process to this conversation. If you want to find out more about us, click on the link below to our first episode where we go into great detail on each of our backgrounds. Before we start today, I would ask that if you like what you hear and want more of this content, please click on the like and subscribe buttons below and share this channel with your friends and colleagues. If you click on the notification bell, you will be alerted when we post new episodes. You will also find a link below where you can donate to this effort. We are a 501c3 nonprofit entity, so all donations are tax deductible. And if you or anyone you know would like to sponsor any of our future episodes, please contact me. To get us going, Baker is going to provide us with the historical context of the congressional budgeting process. After that, we will follow up with comments from our scholars, have Q&A, and we will highlight some key takeaways that you may not hear from the mainstream media. With that, Baker, take it away.
Thank you, Chip. What I want to do is discuss among ourselves and for the benefit of the audience where Congress came from prior to the establishment of a formal budget process in 1974, and then focus on what the meaning of this history is. By my count, there have been 6 systemic level budget process laws enacted by Congress pertaining to its own budgetary process. In other words, not including what the executive branch does. The starting point effectively is 1974. In 1974, the Congress enacted the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. Prior to this act's enactment, Congress really didn't have a formal budget process. It would appropriate spending for most government accounts annually, and on the revenue side, it would adopt tax laws on an ad hoc basis. And obviously, the Congress would go ahead and add up the implications of those laws that are enacted to come in with broad-based numbers about overall spending, overall revenues, deficits, and debt. But there was never a process in place until 1974 that said that you would establish those goals on overall spending, overall revenues, deficits, and debt, and then try to make the legislation for enacting spending and revenue laws conform to those goals. So let's start with the 1974 Act, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. What this did is put in place a two-step system for the Congress to establish its budgets. The first part of that process was the adoption of a budget resolution, which is not presented to the president. It's effectively a commitment Congress makes to itself to subsequently enact spending and revenue measures that reach the goals that are spelled out in the resolution, again, specifically with overall spending, overall revenues, deficits, and debt. The second part of that process is to enact those specific bills. The most important of those bills is called the Reconciliation Act, which is particularly focused with regard to revenues and mandatory or permanent spending, meaning spending that's not appropriated every year. And the other element of that is for the appropriated spending. There are certain things that are important to keep in mind with regard to this act within that context. Most of all federal budgetary accounts are covered by the act, but not all of them. For example, Social Security is declared to be off budget, quote unquote. The second thing they did is in the second part of the title, which is called the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. From the beginning of the constitutional republic, presidents had an implied power to withhold the actual expenditure of funds that were appropriated or authorized by Congress. This portion of the 1974 Act did not outlaw impoundments completely, but it sharply limited them. This was in response to certain abuses by President Nixon of the implied presidential impoundment authority. The way this process was enforced was that there would be points of order that would rest against particular pieces of legislation, whether spending legislation or revenue legislation, that did not meet the requirements of the budget resolution, that it spent more money than it would be permitted under the resolution, or lowered revenue levels to the point that it was not consistent with the budget resolution. And so that the whole idea here was to have Congress make this commitment to itself, and then the actual legislation, which should be subject to presidential signature or veto, to actually come forward and fulfill the requirements of the budget resolution adopted earlier. Actually, there were, in the original Act, two budget resolutions. That process did not really produce balanced budgets from 1974 all the way into the mid-1980s, which leads us to the second of the 6 systemic budget acts, process acts that Congress has enacted. This is called the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, sometimes referred to as by the names of the Senate sponsors of this law, Graham, Rudman, Hollings. This act streamlined the budget process. For example, it reduced those budget resolutions from 2 every year to 1. But more importantly, what it did is it established specific deficit targets, where if they were not met, there would be on the spending side the application of a process that was, in a sense, meant to replace the broader level of presidential impoundment authority. And this was a term called sequestration. Sequestration would meet the deficit targets by applying equal percentage reductions over the baseline to all the affected accounts in equal measure. So if it required, compared to the baseline, and let me say the 1974 Act also established the Congressional Budget Office to do these projections and quote unquote score these spending and revenue bills. And so that once if sequestration were to take effect, it would reduce, compared to that baseline, each of those spending accounts by a set percentage amount. And so that's what happened with regard to budget process in terms of what amounted to amendments to the 1974 Act that were put in place in 1985. The third act is called the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990. This had 2 important aspects to it. It modified things in terms of how budgets would be adopted both budget resolutions and, for example, reconciliation bills in a manner that the Senate's premier parliamentarian, as a member, Senator Byrd, drew up in order to prevent the budget process becoming a way of circumventing entirely the Senate's unlimited debate rule, Rule 22 of the standing rules of the Senate. And so the Byrd rule in slightly modified form still exists today. But the most important thing with this is it established yet another mechanism to try and fill the void left by the strict narrowing of the impoundment authority of the president. And this is called pay-as-you-go mechanism, or PAYGO. And what that did is it said that if there were increases in non-appropriated spending and decreases in revenue, that they had to be offset with increases in other accounts for direct spending, non-appropriated spending, and revenue increases. It was done in context also of caps on appropriated spending. What happened here is the enforcement of PAYGO and the appropriation caps were allowed to essentially terminate in 2002. And in the intervening time, they were frequently circumvented by either waiving the act or defeating points of order that would otherwise rest against particularly spending bills. The fourth major piece of legislation was the Line Item Veto Act of 1996. This permitted the president, and he did exercise it in one instance, to veto specific items within a spending bill and not have to make a decision to veto or sign the whole bill without any of these specific steps to strike a particular line item. That was for naught because the Supreme Court found the entire act unconstitutional in 1998 in the Clinton versus New York decision. So the Line Item Veto Act, which pretty much would have effectively, in my judgment, replaced some measure, a considerable measure of what used to be available to the president in the form of impoundment power, but that was struck down. The fifth such bill is called the Statutory Pay-as-you-go Act. This built upon what was established initially in the 1990 Act, but it made for stronger provisions with regard to the offsets. But Congress has essentially set this aside in every instance. There's never been a full application that I can recall of the offsets that are required by the Statutory Pay-as-you-go Act. How those offsets are calculated is a very complicated formula, and so we can discuss it later if you want. The final major piece of legislation came in the midst of the 2011 impasse between President Obama and Congress over the debt ceiling. What this did is it established a special committee of Congress to propose legislation to reduce the deficit by $1.2 trillion over the 10-year budget period. Budget periods typically last a decade. That committee failed to produce a proposal. So that element of legislation went away. The caps on appropriated spending that were nonetheless put in place in the 2011 Act were there, but again, with one exception, were raised or avoided by overruling points of order. And this was incredibly strong in terms of the spending that was permitted in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This 10-year period of the appropriation spending caps is going to expire in a matter of days at the end of the current fiscal year. So let me just talk about two narrower aspects of the budget process that are not systemic, but I think need to be touched upon. One is the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is established by Congress so as the Treasury cannot issue debt above the level of the cap, commonly referred to as the debt subject to limit. According to the Congressional Research Service, this ceiling has been raised or temporarily suspended 24 times between 1993 and 2019. A number of times, Congress and the executive branch have reached the impasses, as they did in 2011, as I alluded to earlier. And on a few occasions, the impasses went on long enough to approach the limit in a way that raised the prospect of federal default on its debt obligations. Again, this was particularly the case in 2011. And what happens is that the Treasury in these areas at these times of approaching the debt ceiling has employed what's called extraordinary measures. Those are essentially accounting gimmicks that serve to slow the rate of increase in the actual debt as to avoid running up against the ceiling. It's a very difficult job to try and time out when these extraordinary measures will no longer be employable without breaking budget rules. And in this case, the Congressional Research Service says that extraordinary measures have been employed 3 times between March of 2017 and August of 2019. And the Treasury is employing them now. This would be the 4th time. That started at the end of last month. Appropriations, which I've alluded to earlier, are those funds, those accounts in the federal budget that are appropriated annually. The problem with the appropriations process is it's not been living up to its responsibilities. That is that not all the appropriations bills have been passed. Rarely have they been passed on time. And the usual response on this is to bundle these appropriations bills together in what's called the single omnibus spending bill. The Pew Research Center says that the Congress has fully employed or observed the appropriations process only 4 times since 1977. So let's take this and see what with these particular efforts in mind, what happens to the actual numbers. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the federal debt held by the public, and that's a smaller portion than what I call the gross debt, because it excludes the debts that Treasury owes to other federal government trust funds, has gone from $246 billion in 1962 to $21 trillion in 2020. If you look at the gross debt today, it's roughly $28.5 trillion. And so it is impossible to avoid coming to the conclusion, in my mind, that the budget process and its failure to operate properly is a major contributing factor to the creation of this frightening debt trend line. And I'm happy to get into discussion now about the implications with regard to this particular history.
Let's open it up to our scholars, our 2 economists. Commentary, follow-up. I know each of us has some questions during the Q&A, but anything off the top of your head, Sven?
Yeah, I can jump in. I can jump in with a question here. That was a very interesting presentation. Baker, if my memory serves me correctly, I think there have been about a dozen proposals to specifically enforce a balanced budget over the past 40 years.
Okay.
They have been, if I recall it right, most, if not all, have been statutory in nature, and they've all been based on congressional self-enforcement. Needless to say, they've all failed. We've only had, since I believe 1969, we've only had 4 years of a balanced federal budget.
Yes.
That was Clinton's 2nd term. The lack of interest in self-enforcement, would you say there's a connection between the budget process itself and the inability of Congress to balance the budget?
Yes, absolutely. And you can look at that at 2 levels. One is the nature of how Congress legislates, generally on any issue, and the others that are more specific to the budget. Let's deal with the latter first. The budget processes have always been put in place as a commitment Congress makes to itself without presidential involvement. And as a result, the budget process itself permits Congress to release itself from the requirements of the process. Let's take an easy example. There's a natural disaster. A spending bill in responding to that natural disaster can be designated emergency spending, not subject to the act. And it's done pretty routinely. The other, as I suggested, is that you can have a point of order that rests against the budget, against a particular bill because of budgetary requirements. But those points of orders can be overwritten by simple majority vote in the House and by effectively 60 vote margins in the Senate. And that happens fairly frequently. Now let's deal with it at the more fundamental level, which is how Congress legislates. Congress legislates as a body that is the sole possessor of the power to legislate in the future. So every law that Congress enacts is subject to a future action by Congress to modify that law, repeal that law, whatever it deems fit. And as the saying goes on Capitol Hill, is no current Congress can bind a future Congress. And so what you've seen with regard to the statutory budget process reforms that have been enacted subsequent to the 1974 Act are effectively steps like that to modify the process, which Congress always has the power to do if it sees fit.
Robert.
So the thing that, from my perspective, I tend to look at politicians' incentives and why they would choose to do things that maybe just don't make sense or seem all that great. And as I look at this history, it looks to me like the problem has almost gotten worse with every step of these attempts at reform. Is there anything in these laws that maybe alters how the Congress operates, or is it just a matter of increasing federal responsibilities in general? Maybe it's the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates too low, but we didn't have such a bad problem before these attempts to reform it.
I would say this to a certain degree. The way that I would categorize is there has been a cultural shift in Congress. When you go back to the earlier years of the post-World War II period, there was a fairly strong consensus in Congress that debt was a bad thing. You'd have members of Congress that wanted to spend more and tax more, and members of Congress that wanted to spend less and tax less. But generally, there was a fairly strong pillar of agreement that high levels of debt were not a safe place to be. And so,
it was just on the heels of a major crisis in World War II, which kind of reinforced that. Right.
And so that the problem didn't really come to a head, in my judgment, and this is going to be a judgment call on my part, until about 1974. And what was the big thing that was driving the 1974 Act, in my opinion? You could go back and look at the history, and you'll find myriad people that came to support the enactment of that act. But to me, it was this growing shift in federal outlays from annually appropriated spending to permanent so-called mandatory spending that was essentially on autopilot. And when that was put into place, and it grew all the way back from the 1930s to where it's very significant now, well more than the appropriated spending. in terms of total federal outlays. It generated a cultural shift that said, actually, it's okay to have effectively what amounts to permanent deficits. Put it somewhat differently, is that I would say is that what we've seen is the American public generally, and Congress both urging them on and following them at the same time, have become what I would call addicted to stimulus. That is that it's become an unspoken understanding, I think, in Congress today, that there's no downside to additional stimulus to the economy in the forms of deficit spending.
Baker,
And so much of this is already on autopilot.
that was my question to you,
Yeah.
Baker. Coming from, I'm a CPA by background, dealing with, corporate finance and budgeting, and from everything you've said and everything I've read from your writings and all that, I cannot find anywhere where there's even an attempt by Congress to match up the revenues to the expenses. They just don't care. It doesn't matter. They're handled completely differently, and it doesn't matter what one number is versus the other. It all goes back to the fact, in my opinion, that they know it really doesn't matter because they have the ability to access unlimited debt right now.
That's certainly a major enabler. I would say this too, with regard to the congressional budget process, narrowly defined, is that it was supposed to be a tool for getting the budgets that Congress wants. It was not designed to dictate outcomes. That was something that would be controlled by the process, but the process did not have, as in my judgment, a core element that there would be permanently set levels of spending, permanently set levels of revenue, and therefore balanced budgets and no more accumulating debt. Yes, there have been acts like, for example, the 1985 Act that established deficit ceilings. But again, we found that when they attempted to do that, the Congress in the end, for lack of a better term, rebelled against them. And so that the understanding at the outset in 1974 was we have a budget process to govern how we arrive at those targets, but not dictate the targets themselves.
Baker, can I throw in another question here?
Yeah.
I took some time just out of personal interest a while back, and I looked at the growth rate in federal spending and correlated that with party majorities in Congress and the party affiliation of the president.
Right.
And I went back to right after World War II, and what I found in this impromptu research was that it seems as though spending growth is the smallest when you have Republican majorities in Congress and a Democrat in the White House.
Is
that your impression as well?
That is my impression. And to some degree, it's coincidental, but it's also to some degree true that Congress does have the power to appropriate, commonly referred to as the power of the purse. And if you have Congress that's going to be willing to be more restrained, there's not much the president can do about that. He can't write the bill. He can only decide to sign or veto it. And so if you have fiscal conservatives in Congress, even in the face of a more fiscal liberal in the form of the president, the president, in the most prominent example, President Clinton, can't feed the money that he wants to his favored groups. And so there's not much point for him to try and do that. if Congress is truly dedicated to cutting him off from doing that, from driving federal dollars to his favored constituents. But I'd also say this with regard to the Clinton presidency, which I don't think you understand it, but I think that the public maybe doesn't appreciate it as much. In that particular time frame, in addition to what you very correctly observed with regard to the party relationship between Congress and the president, was an incredible demographic tailwind on the budget. The baby boomers were at the height of their earnings power. And then on top of that, there was the dot-com technological boom. And so that, in my judgment, what was very strong tailwinds in favor of fiscal responsibility for these demographic reasons in the late 1990s is now become a howling headwind as the baby boomers retire in droves.
As a quick follow-up on that, related to it, because I think this is really interesting if we want to understand the dynamics of federal budgeting. During the Obama presidency, if I remember correctly, Congress relied a great deal on continuing resolutions as opposed to passing a budget. As a result, by happenstance, there was restraint on spending growth, at least in Obama's second term. How would you say that plays into the budgeting process? Is it something that needs to be fixed, or is it a good, so to speak, option if they can't agree on a budget?
Right. Let me say is that there's two things that you need to observe about that. In terms of the history, the spending increases that occurred were largely in the Obama first term for two reasons. One had to do with the 2008 financial crisis that grew out of the real estate sector, and Obamacare, the enactment of Obamacare. So let me deal with the second first. The enactment of Obamacare was yet another layer of spending going into the monies that are not appropriated every year. And so those are again added to the autopilot programs. And so there wasn't much that anybody in the appropriations side could really do about that. And as the appropriations monies, right now, Congress is dealing with a budget that's in the neighborhood, I believe, of about $6 trillion for the upcoming fiscal year. Only about 1.5 trillion of that is in appropriated spending now. The rest is either in the mandatory programs, as they call them, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt, which is something entirely different. How you budget for interest costs is a matter we can discuss. It's very important in and of itself. So that yes, by the time that the Republicans took hold of Congress in the second half of Obama's first term, where they really did have the power on the appropriations side, there's not much that Obama could do to offset that, other than to let the mandatory programs continue to run on unaddressed.
Baker, let me understand that. You said of the $6 trillion appropriations, only 1.5 of that is subject to the budget process. Is that correct? Are you saying 75% of the appropriations are basically on autopilot?
No, not quite. They're on autopilot, but they are part of the budget process. But those monies are not required to be appropriated by Congress every year, year in and year out. It's the smaller figure is they're all subject to the budget process, with the exception of the off-budget items, Social Security being the big one. But appropriated spending and mandatory spending are subject to budget process, but in different ways. And the advantage on the appropriation side is that Congress does come back and address those every year. And so that there's a more consistent approach with regard to legislating the spending in those accounts. But in the end, the real source of our budget problem on the spending side is with the so-called mandatory programs.
One question I have, it kind of shifts gears a little bit, but looking at this whole time frame along the way, if we go back to the 1970s, there were some laws that gave the Federal Reserve greater control over the money supply, and shortly after that, we had Volcker at the Fed who raised interest rates to put a stop to inflation, and that, of course, raised the financing costs on the debt. And really, ever since that crisis in the 1980s ended, interest rates have been low on government by historical norms,
Right.
to the point that today, the financing costs for the national debt are considerably lower than they were in the 1980s. And I wonder to what extent that's contributed to the cultural shift. And we talk about the Fed not being independent now, but it seems like there's been a complicity issue for a few decades now.
Well, certainly it is the case that a low interest rate policy by the Fed is an enabler for spending by Congress. That becomes compounded in recent years. There's been starting in 2008, effectively, a large scale increase in the amount that the Federal Reserve, or let me put it this way, it's more frequent and larger use of the non-interest rate element of its monetary policy. And that non-interest rate element is the buying of certain debt instruments in order to pump money into the economy. And a major portion of that is Treasury securities themselves. And to the extent that the Federal Reserve is using that particular mechanism, which is different from the question of where they set the interest rates through the so-called Fed funds rate, among others, as a way that it really does enable Congress to spend more money, because it's taking all the pressure off the private sector investors that would otherwise have to finance the debt that Congress is running up by the expenditures. Because what happens is that the private investors go out and buy the Treasury securities knowing full well that the Federal Reserve will take them off their hands, so that they're not faced with the tough choice about whether they actually have the money to be able to finance the debt. There's a particular way to look at that if you really want to get into the weeds. The Treasury Department at every auction publishes what they call the bid to cover ratio on whatever the Treasury securities that are being auctioned at that auction. What is the bid to cover ratio? The auctions are conducted by the Treasury saying we want to raise, say, $100 billion at this auction. And we open that to the bidders. And how much money do the bidders bring? Do they bring $150 billion? Do they bring $200 billion? But if you see either dramatic or sustained declines in that bid to cover ratio, then you're going to find that the private sector is either unwilling or unable to finance the debt, and they're relieved of making a hard choice when they face that, if they know the Federal Reserve's got their back, that they can just go back and sell the securities they bought at auction to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, these are just ledger transactions. Milton Friedman, I think it was quoted as saying, well, it's the equivalent of, throwing dollar bills or $100 bills or whatever it is out of an helicopter. Well, that's not the way the Federal Reserve does it. The Federal Reserve, in this mechanism, puts money into the circulation in the economy by essentially taking these debt instruments off the hands of people in the private sector.
I know one of our upcoming segments is going to be on the Federal Reserve and its program of buying Treasury bonds, the open market process that they go through. And I think that would be a good one if we would fold in our conversation on modern monetary theory along with that, because it goes hand in glove, I believe, in both. I'm really looking forward to that. We've got about 15 minutes left in this episode. It sounds to me like whatever potential solution to this budgeting process you would propose somehow has to deal with the fact that the government can and does borrow without limit. And Baker, I was hoping you could expand a little bit more on the proposal that you think might be one potential solution to this problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's go back again and look at the twin issues. The twin issues are Congress's inability or unwillingness to budget responsibly, and the other is the legislative problem that I alluded to, which is that Congress can always change the law in the future from what it is today. That's why it becomes almost unavoidable that you got to go to the pinnacle of the legal structure to get a process that can actually work, and that means a constitutional amendment. That constitutional amendment is not likely to be proposed by Congress itself. And so the Constitution only provides one other means for amending the Constitution, and that's for the states to propose it. And so that I think that that's going to have to be the way that it's done. Now, let me say, too, is that carries with it a very important implication is what is that amendment going to say? If the amendment says the federal government has to have a balanced budget year in and year out, unless it invokes some sort of exit ramp from it that's built into the amendment language, is probably not a good idea. What you need is a mechanism that will make sure that Congress has to balance budgets over time, not in every individual year. Because that tool is too inflexible. And the other thing it has to do is it has to create a mechanism or create a circumstance where everybody understands that not every dollar spent by the federal government is of equal national interest. One of the reasons that sequestration has never worked in my judgment, and there's two of them, but one of those reasons is that to take a broad category of spending and say all of it is equally responsible and every dollar spent by the federal government has an equivalent amount of social value. That's just patently untrue. And so that you in sequestration, by applying this cross-the-board percentage, I think failed in large measure because of that. The other thing is that what it's got to do, procedurally, Congress has created a situation of what I call budget balkanization. There's things that are off budget. There are things that are subject to points of order that are not. Other elements of spending are not subject to those points of order. You have omnibus appropriations bills. You have continuing resolutions, so forth and so on. When you don't have a truly unified federal budget, then it just becomes unmanageable. And so the text of a balanced, what would be a balanced budget amendment, is not really a balanced budget amendment. It's a debt controlling amendment. And so it provides you with the circumstance where Congress has very stringent requirements, but not laced into a straitjacket that's just untenable or counterproductive.
May I jump in real quick? That's an essential point that you're making. There is pretty strong macroeconomic evidence that when you enforce a balanced budget, every year with the rigor that you describe. When the economy goes into a recession, you actually amplify the recession because you're forced to take money out of the economy when it's already in decline. You can also end up in the other end, over amplifying a growth period, but especially on the downside in a recession, the economy responds faster in a recession than it does in a growth period. So a debt control instrument is far better from a macroeconomic viewpoint. The other quick point I want to throw in is that when it comes to prioritizing and sequestration, there is equally strong, not quite equally strong, but a fair amount of empirical evidence that shows that when government spending reaches about 40% of GDP, you start seeing a permanent slowdown in economic growth as a direct correlation, and it's fairly easy to explain the causality there. In other words, if you concentrate spending limits to the less essential parts of the government budget, the functions that are more easily transferred to the private sector, you can keep the economy from reaching that 40% point, and you can still fairly simply enforce budget balancing under a debt control instrument.
And it's important that that's not a hard debt limit that's in existence forever that can never be violated. I don't think you're proposing. It's creating a process that if more debt is needed by the federal government, there's a process to go through to make sure that that's the right amount of debt for what Congress intends to do over time. But we got to get away from completely unlimited debt that's been the status quo for the past 20 years.
And I would say this in terms of the practical elements of it, and that is that we really do need to reunify the budget, procedurally and substantively. If I had my druthers, I would make all spending, with the exception of payments for covering government debts, whether those be interest payments or principal payments, that everything else would be subject to annual appropriations. I think that the founding fathers would be astounded to know that, let's just pick a round number, that Congress would establish a program like Social Security that would effectively be able to go unmolested, unreviewed for 50 years and say that's a proper appropriation as the founding fathers envisioned it. I really don't think so. When they wrote that appropriations clause, they anticipated that Congress would come back to provide those monies on a quite frequent basis. And I think we need to get back to that concept of budgeting.
When we poll the public on the need for a balanced budget, it's overwhelmingly north of 80% of people say Congress should be operating under a balanced budget, just like 49 of the 50 states have to do. But I think we've all realized that it's what's in a balanced budget amendment. What is the actual text? How thoughtful is the balanced budget amendment that's going to be key to seeing if some type of balanced budget amendment can really be part of the solution rather than contributing to the problem.
I think that's exactly right.
And lo and behold, we've got a balanced budget amendment contained in the Compact for a Balanced Budget. And I think that would be a good subject for our next episode, would to actually be to go into the details of the balanced budget amendment to see how that particular amendment might address each of the issues that you guys have brought up in this conversation today. I would look forward to that one. Baker, where are we currently in terms of projections for the federal budget? Is it going to get better? You see it? Is it going to get worse?
Well, the Senate
forecast.
The Senate has just adopted on a on what it effectively is a straight party line vote, that will have deficits above $1 trillion in every year over the 10-year budget period from fiscal year 2022, the upcoming fiscal year, which begins in a matter of days, through fiscal year 2031. That will make the debt subject to limit jump from, as I say, roughly $28.5 trillion today to $45 trillion. I mean, it's just unimaginable amounts of money that you're talking about here. And that's in the context of a budget resolution that would also significantly raise revenue through some pretty ambitious tax proposals, like taxing unrealized capital gains, as one of the things that might be included in that. And you got to remember that the budget resolution only sets those top line numbers. The actual spending and the actual revenue provisions that would be enacted law come later. So with the budget resolution that was just adopted by the Senate a week or so ago, that is really a outline or a skeleton structure of what would ultimately be put in place by the combination of the reconciliation bill and the annually appropriated spending.
And what's the timing on them finishing up that budgeting process?
Let me break it into its two components. The budget resolution is now before the House. I would expect them to take that up and adopt either what the Senate has proposed or something that's fairly similar sometime next month. Then what will happen is once the budget resolution is adopted by both houses, then what they call the reconciliation instructions that are in the budget resolution are applied to the other committees of Congress, whether they be revenue-raising committees like the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee, and the authorizing committees that are handling the accounts that are not within the annually appropriated ones. And they will draft the specific provisions for spending and revenue that the budget resolution only spells out in skeletal form. And so I would anticipate that will be done October. I'd say maybe before the end of October would be my best guess. Now, there's one thing that is driving a potential deadline here. Or two things, actually. One's more important than the other, though. And that's the debt ceiling issue. There has been widespread discussion, particularly in the Senate, about incorporating an increase in the debt ceiling or a resumption of the suspension of the debt ceiling law in the reconciliation bill. At some point, I would say, I think it'll be around the start of the first of the new fiscal year, which is on October 1. Is that the extraordinary measures will be very close to exhausted. And so if they decide that they are going to put that into the reconciliation bill, then they do face a hard deadline. That is probably, in my judgment, around the first of the fiscal year or early October. My numbers are more pessimistic than Congressional Budget Office's, for example, on that. But that could be one driver. The other thing is too, and this isn't as important because there's all sorts of things they can do with regard to this, but they will face a case with the appropriated accounts that with the end of the fiscal year, there'll be a partial government shutdown if they don't get things wrapped up. Now, they could do a continuing resolution or they could do all sorts of other things that would get them out from the ladder. But the other thing with regard to the debt ceiling, that's something that would, if they choose to go down this road of putting the debt ceiling provision within the reconciliation bill, that would make that a not precisely known but widely expected hard deadline.
So let me see if I can summarize your takeaways and tell me if I'm correct. One, Congress has repeatedly tried to reform the congressional budgeting process to advance a policy of fiscal responsibility and has, as a general matter, failed. Number two,
Yeah.
current projections for the federal budget show the problem is getting dramatically worse and default is increasingly likely. And three, a constitutional amendment, in your opinion, could be one potential solution.
Yes, that you've hit the nail on the head. I think that's exactly right. But I also, with their first point, I wanted to keep one thing in mind. I've only hit on the ones where there's been enough gumption in Congress to actually enact a law in this area. I haven't dealt with the myriad failed attempts of proposals that did not get passed into law. So, in a sense, what I've described as no systemic, sustainable solution to the budgeting problem, and I've only limited myself to the peak successes of the attempts that have been tried. I mean, there's a far broader history here of, I couldn't even begin to estimate how many times that Congress has had proposals that attempted to reform the process that haven't even gotten, serious consideration. So what I gave you in my initial presentation are essentially the peak efforts.
You're saying it's a big problem.
It's a big problem, and it's going to be one where there's all sorts of bad habits.
Big
that
problem,
are going to have
bad
to be
habits.
that are going to have to be addressed. And by the way, Congress isn't the only one with these bad habits. It comes back to what I said earlier about this attitude of what I call an addiction to stimulus.
Well, thanks, Baker. Really informative. Sven, do you have any parting comments?
No, I think this was exhaustive and very informative. Good job, Baker.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert?
No, I think it's been very well done. Very informative for me as well. I think it's just about perfect.
Well, thanks, Baker. And once again, I would ask that if you like what you have heard and want more of this content, please click on the like and subscribe buttons below and share this channel with your friends and colleagues. And if you click the notification bell, you will be alerted when we post that next episode on the Balanced Budget Amendment. Our goal is to be able to provide a new episode on a weekly basis. The next episode, like I said, will be on the Balanced Budget Amendment. Thanks for watching. Let's all work together on a nonpartisan basis to restore fiscal sanity to this great country. See you next week. Bye.